James Bond. The name is synonymous with suave secret agents, fast cars, upper-class living, wealth, and women. When you think of secret spy, chances are you're thinking of 007. With 22 official films in the franchise, not to mention hordes of video games, comic books, CDs, spin-offs, and parodies, you've had to have heard of this guy at one point or another. And if you're somehow not familiar with the series, you've at least seen something that borrows from it. James Bond, the suave British agent who escapes death at every turn, is known for using an arsenal of top-secret weapons he conveniently has at his disposal, drives deluxe, fast-paced cars, and has a soft spot for attractive females. He's been played officially by 6 different actors over the course of 46 years, with another film in the making and scheduled for release in 2012, which would make for the longest-running film series ever conceived, 50 years. He's battled villains on basically every continent, ranging from your run-of-the-mill extortionists to your colorful comic book bad guys, and he always manages to come out of it without a scratch. The series' influence stretches over vast mediums. It's common knowledge, at least in the film community, that the Indiana Jones franchise started with Steven Spielberg wanting to do his own James Bond movie. Of course, George Lucas came along with his idea for Raiders, and the rest is history. But back to the man of the hour. While I admit I'm not a hardcore fan of the series, I've seen all of the Bond films several times. I've attempted to do a review of the series for a while, but it's a little hard to keep track of 22 films that sometimes look so similar when looking at the entire series. The Bond films aren't known for the great stories or developed characters. You go to a Bond movie for the action, the exotic locations, the steaming hot females, and just to see what gadgets he has at his disposal this time. They're hard films to talk about because honestly, aside from that, there's really not a lot of depth. But I have to admit, even I find most of them a real joy to sit through. They range from dark and serious to ridiculously hokey, but it's the variety that keeps me watching. Maybe one film will deal with some serious industrial espionage and a heist caper, while another one deals with a comic book villain and some strange island somewhere. Regardless of how you take your Bond, there's so much material to work with. Now, I'm only going to cover the United Artists Bond films, which fans consider the official films or the Eon films. These are the films you buy together in expensive DVD sets. There were a few unofficial Bond films that were developed by other companies. Since I haven't seen these films, I won't bother giving them full coverage, so I'll briefly mention them now. In 1983, Warner Brothers released Never Say Never Again. It was directed by Empire Strikes Back director Irvin Kershner and was essentially a remake of 1965's Thunderball. It was a big deal at the time because Sean Connery would reprise the role of James Bond after not donning the role since 1971's Diamonds Are Forever. It was a commercial success, but because it wasn't an MGM film, it was never considered part of the canon. Then there's Casino Royale, a parody of Ian Fleming's novel in which a bunch of James Bond impersonators caused the real James Bond to come out of retirement. It was helmed by several directors and is most notable for starring Peter Sellers, Woody Allen, and Ursula Andress. Once again, because it's a parody and it was made before any of the Eon films, it isn't considered a part of the canon. Incidentally, Casino Royale was the only one of Fleming's original novels that wasn't picked up for film. That didn't happen until years later when Daniel Craig donned the role and the official Casino Royale was finally made. So anyway, let's talk about Dr. No, the first official film introducing the world to James Bond. It was directed by Terrence Young and stars Sean Connery as 007. Most fans would agree that Connery is definitely the best actor for the role, and that's a hard one to debate. When most people think of Bond, they think of Sean Connery. He was probably the one that took the role most seriously, and I attribute part of that to the fact that, well, he was the first. This was a time where the character of James Bond hadn't really broken out into the mainstream, so he didn't have a lot of material to work with and was pretty much able to develop the character as the films went on. Switch to the 90s, where you have Pierce Brosnan taking the reins. You can see in his performance that he pretty much took bits and pieces from Roger Moore and Sean Connery. So Connery was definitely the most original in his approach to the character. One of the most famous images is his introduction at the card table, where he says what has to be one of the most quoted lines in film history.
I admire your luck, Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
Only Connery was able to deliver that line exactly that way. It's simple, yet effective. He's also got a sort of edge that the later Bonds lacked. Don't get me wrong, he has a few one-liners every once in a blue moon.
How did it happen? I think they were on their way to a funeral.
But as much as he loves women, he'll turn on one real fast if it's to his advantage. He's charming but sophisticated. A gentleman when he wants to be, but a secret agent when he has to be. There's not a lot of playfulness to Connery's Bond, and I think a lot of fans appreciate that. The film opens, and we get another famous Bond tradition, the opening sequence. You've seen this before. Come on, I know you have. James Bond walks into the middle of a gun barrel that's focusing on him, and then, bam! Bond shoots right back at us. The screen goes red, and the mystery attacker falls dead. Then the titles start. Both the gun barrel sequence and the opening titles were originally created by Maurice Binder. As the films went on, the opening sequences became much more elaborate, but they've always been a staple of the franchise to this day. It's not a Bond movie unless it's got the official gun barrel opening stamp of approval. So after the famous title sequence, we follow 3 African-American men who appear to be blind. Right away, they kill a British secret agent named John Strangways, as well as the secretary. Notice the jump cut here when they shoot her. It might look a little funny, but that was actually the style of editor Peter Hunt, who edited this way on purpose to make the film move at a quicker pace. It's a little jarring, but it seems to work. After the 3 blind mice kill the secretary, they steal a file labeled Dr. No. MI6 calls on Bond to investigate Strangway's murder. This is the first time we're introduced to Miss Moneypenny, played by Lois Maxwell, who James always flirts with at the beginning of every film. Lois Maxwell was actually a series regular, playing the role in every Bond film until she retired as M secretary in 1985's A View to a Kill. We also meet Bond's boss, M, played by Bernard Lee, another longtime series veteran. The idea of James Bond answering to someone has always been a little hard to swallow, but I always liked his sincerity in the role. After he briefs Bond on his mission to Kingston, he scolds him for carrying a Beretta, since it jammed on him in his last mission. He also points out that since he became head of MI6, he reduced 00 casualties by 40%. Before we know it, he's giving Bond a signature Walter PPK. I love the way Major Boothroyd describes the gun's impact.
Walter PPK, 7.65 mil with a delivery like a brick through a plate glass window. Takes a Brausch silencer with very little reduction in muzzle velocity.
In subsequent films, this actor would be replaced by none other than Desmond Llewellyn as Q, the one actor who's been in more Bond films than any other actor. That's an accomplishment. Before James departs for Kingston, he gets to his apartment where he finds Sylvia Trench, the woman from the card table playing a round of mini-golf. This is the only time we see her in the film, and she only serves to define Bond's role as a womanizing playboy. But interestingly enough, she has a reoccurring role in the next Bond film, From Russia with Love. This rarely happens because in each film, including this one, he ends up with a different girl. At the airport, James gets picked up by a chauffeur, who he realizes early on is an imposter. He tells the driver to take the scenic route, and when they get to a clearing, Bond pulls a gun on him. This is a pretty satisfying fight. No hidden weapons, no guns, just some simple acrobatics. Bond tries to get some information out of him, but before he has a chance, the driver poisons himself. Bond then attempts to follow a man named Quarrel. Quarrel gets suspicious when Bond asks too many questions and corners him in the back room of a restaurant. Bond gets the upper hand when he's once again caught off guard, this time by a CIA agent named Felix Leiter, the agent who was working with Strangway before he disappeared. The character of Felix appears in several Bond movies, but is always played by a different actor. In this one, he's played by Jack Lord, who would later go on to play Detective Steve McGarrett in Hawaii Five-0. In the next scene, we're treated to a hearty rendition of one of this film's main themes, Jump Up, which is strangely catchy.
Jump up, Jamaica, jump up, Jamaica, jump up, music, Jamaica.
Felix identifies that Dr. No owns the nearby island of Crab Key, which is heavily guarded. During their conversation, a journalist tries to take their picture, but James sets her straight. Bond then pays Professor R.J. Dent, a geologist, a visit because he worked with Strangways to analyze rock samples taken from Crab Key. We discover that Dent is actually working for Dr. No and plans to kill Bond using a poisonous spider. This makes for a pretty suspenseful scene later when Bond has to time his movements just right to avoid being bitten. Notice how his arm moves, but the spider doesn't match his movements. But it's a 60s film, so just go with it. I also like how the music matches whenever Bond smacks at the spider on the ground. It's one of the defining scenes of the movie. Then there's this car chase scene. Pretty exciting, but it doesn't really have much to do with the plot. It's another tired cliche of the genre when the exterior car shots are blended with the interior shots of the driver and the background is obviously a screen projection. Today this is used strictly for parody like in the Austin Powers films, but back then this was how it was done. It's pretty cheesy, but again, effective given the time period. Then there's the bit with the Asian woman, which labels Bond as a pure womanizer, and in my opinion, is one of his more flawed qualities. He suspects the whole time that she's working with Dr. No, but he goes out with her anyways. He even goes so far as to sleep with her, and just as they're about to leave, he puts her in a car with the local law enforcement. In the end, it's funny because she turns out to be a minor villain, but did he have to take advantage of her? It's just Bond being Bond, I guess. It's followed shortly with this scene where Bond sets up the woman's bedroom and waits for Dent to arrive to kill him in the middle of the night. He sits by the door and plays a game of solitaire until Dent arrives, and the whole time it's like he has everything planned out. It's a short scene, but satisfying. Quarrel takes Bond to Crab Key, where they spend the night. In the morning, Bond meets Honey Rider, played by the desirable Swiss actress Ursula Andress. The shot of her coming out of the water in that bikini has been a long talked about sex image for decades, and is one of the most voluptuous images in the entire series. Honey collects seashells, and as it turns out, is pretty sophisticated, and James hits on her the first chance he gets. It's very suave, very stylish, but come on, what else would you call it? He's basically spying on her while she's singing.
Underneath the mango tree, my honey and me.
On the island, they evade the guards, and eventually they have to hide in a swamp. Bond uses the underwater reeds to breathe through, and then when the timing's just right, he gets the drop on one of the guards. Earlier in the film, Quarrel mentions that the locals don't like to visit Crab Key because there's word of a dragon. Well, they finally meet up with this dragon, and as it turns out, it's basically a miniature tank that uses a flamethrower to scare people away. They get caught while Quarrel gets burned to a crisp. Honey and James are taken inside Dr. No's quarters, where they get checked for radiation. This could have been where that whole cleansing scene from Austin Powers came from. After all this build-up, they finally meet Dr. No, played by Joseph Wiseman. If anything, this guy knows how to live in style. He's got a giant aquarium built into his wall, for goodness sakes. He reveals that he's working for a top-secret organization called Spectre, Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, and Extortion. That's a mouthful. But that's also an important piece of information because Spectre would become the dominant criminal body throughout the majority of the series. His best line is where he flat-out insults Bond, calling him a stupid policeman.
Unfortunately, I misjudged you. You are just a stupid policeman.
That's just funny. So anyway, Dr. No reveals some kind of radioactive experiment he's running out of his facility. Honestly, I can't say a whole lot about the details because it's confusing and not that important. Why is it that Bond villains always have a hard time describing their plots to the good guys? It's like, what is your plan, Dr. No? Well, Mr. Bond, I intend to take over the Cape Canaveral space launch using my own atomic-powered radio beam. I built it myself. And how does this work exactly? Well, Listen, I'm just going to use a bunch of radiation to take over the world! Lame. So Bond is taken back to his cell where he wakes up, escapes, crawls through a tunnel that is booby-trapped with a burning hot floor, steals a man's radiation outfit, makes his way to Dr. No's laboratory, raises the temperature of the water, kills Dr. No, rescues Honey from a pool of slowly rising water, and escapes from the facility as it goes up in flames. All in the span of about 20 minutes. They're picked up by Felix and his band of do-gooders, but deciding he needs some alone time with Miss Ryder, he lets go of the rope connecting him to the rescue boat, and the movie ends. As the very first James Bond movie, I've got to tell you, it's really good. Obviously, the action is pretty tame compared to later installments, but it's actually pretty easy to follow, and it does a great job establishing the character. It's actually considered one of the best in the series, and given just how many chapters there have been, that's saying something. As the series went on and James Bonds came and went, the filmmaking became lazier, and eventually the simplicity and the detective-like stories took back seats to lavish gadgetry and an abundance of action. There were some good ones and some laughable ones, but this one is a pretty steady installment and definitely set the stage for all the films to come. Even if you're not a James Bond fan, you really should check this one out for its historical value.